Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Welcome to this session of research sampling. And by the end of this session, you should be able to demonstrate an understanding of sampling, and you should be able to identify and justify the types of sampling techniques. So before we start, let's kickstart with this short quiz. What do we understand by the concepts or the terms population? What do we understand by the term sample? And what do we understand by the term sample fraction or sampling fraction? What do we understand by the term population? What do we understand by the term sample? And what do we understand by the term sampling fraction? Any ideas? Okay. So population is the complete set of cases or group of members, right? This is a complete set of people with specialized set of characteristics. In real sense, it is the entire pool from which your samples are drawn, right? Population is the complete set of people with specialized set of traits, specialized set of characteristics. It is, in real sense, the entire pool from which your samples are drawn. Now, a good question again will be, what do we understand as samples? So samples are a subgroup or a part of a larger population, right? Samples are subsets of the population, right? In research, sample is made up of a group of people or objects or items taken from a larger population, right? And samples are always representative of the population to ensure that we can generalize the findings from the research sample to the population as a whole. So samples are always representative of the population to ensure that we can generalize the findings from the sample to the population as a whole. And the next is, what do we understand by sampling fraction? What is sampling fraction? So sampling fraction is known as the ratio of the sample size to the population size. Sampling fraction or a sample fraction is known as a ratio of the sample size to the population size. Now, the sample fraction represents the portion of population units that are selected in the sample size. A sample fraction represents the proportion of the population units that are selected in the sample. So in summary, right, it is the proportion of the total population selected from a probability sample. It is the proportion of the total population selected from a probability sample. Okay, so that answers the quiz questions. So where do we go from here? Let's move on to the next slide. So a very good question students always ask, and where students often struggle, is when asked, what do you understand by the term sampling? Right? What do you understand by the term sampling, right? So as stated, sampling represents the population of your study. It represents the population of your study. It allows for a collected snapshot or a detailed account from the field, right? It allows for a snapshot or a detailed account from the field. So in a nutshell, it means selecting a group that you will actually collect your data from for your research. It means identifying or selecting a group that you will actually collect your data from for your research. Now, an important guideline for sampling implies that the power, right, and the logic behind the selection of the participants or the respondents or the informants, right, it is that sample must be information rich. So if you're going out to seek or come up to think around your sample, you must ensure that the selection of respondents should be able to provide you with rich sources of information. Hence, in order to achieve the best explanations of the particular phenomenon or the particular aspects that will help you address your research questions, your research topic, right, your samples must be determined according to the needs of your study. Your sample must be determined according to the needs of your study. Right, so let us look at the different types of sampling, right? Let us look at the different types of sampling. So within research, right, the two main types of sampling techniques are the probability and the non-probability sampling. Probability and non-probability sampling, right? These are the two main types of sampling techniques, right? Probability is defined as a sampling technique in which the researcher chooses from a larger population using a method based on the theory of probability. Probability sampling is defined as a sampling technique in which the researcher chooses from a larger population using a method based on the theory of probability. Now, this implies that for a participant to be considered as a probability sample, he or she must be selected using a random selection. Right? This means that for a participant to be considered as a probability sample, he or she must be selected using what we call a random selection. Right? So on the other hand, non-probability sampling, right, is a research method in which not all members of the population have an equal chance of participating in the study. Right? So unlike probability sampling, non-probability sampling is a research method or is a research technique, right? Research sampling technique in which not all members of the population have an equal chance of participating in the study. So to do a quick recap, right? Probability sampling, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected, right? In non-probability sampling, right, it does not involve random processes of selection. So let's look at some types or the types of probability sampling. So we've got under probability, we've got simple, we've got stratified, we've got systematic, we've got cluster, right? Non-probability, we've got quota, we've got snowball, we've got convenience, self-selection, and purposive. Right, so this is a quick recap of probability sampling, right? Probability sampling is very, very much linked to survey-based research strategies. Yeah, this is quite an important part, right? Probability sampling is very much linked to survey-based research strategies. Here, you're trying to make inference from their sample about the population towards making or towards answering your research questions or towards achieving your research objectives. Probability sampling, right, involves 4 stages. Yes, identifying a suitable sampling frame based on research questions, deciding on a suitable sample size, selecting the most appropriate sampling technique and selecting the sample, and of course, checking that the sample is representative of the population. So let's look at some types of probability sampling techniques. Now, the first one is the simple sampling, or what we call the simple random sampling. Now, the simple random sampling involves selecting the sample at random from the given sampling frame using either random numbers or a computer. Right? Simple random sampling involves selecting the sample at random from a given sampling frame using either random number tables or a computer. Now, what the random sampling allows you to do is it allows you to make selections without bias. Random sampling allows you to make your selections without bias, right? And it is best used when you have an accurate and easily accessible sampling frame, right? And this sampling frame should be able to list aspects of the entire population, right? So simple random sampling, right, involves selecting the sample at random from a given population, right, from a given sampling frame. Right, the next is what we call the stratified sampling. Stratified sampling. When you hear stratified, you think of strata, putting something in strata right? So stratified sampling is a type of sampling where you divide your population into two or more relevant and significant strata based on a number of particular attributes. Stratified sampling is a type of sampling whereby you divide your population into two or more relevant and significant strata based on one or a number of attributes. So what you do here is you try to divide your population into series of relevant strata, right? By dividing your population into series of relevant strata, it means that the sample is more likely to be representative as the researcher ensures that each of the strata is represented proportionally within the frame. So here, when you divide your population into series of relevant strata, right, this helps you as a researcher to identify sample which is more likely to be representative of the population, right? And as such, you, the researcher, you are able to ensure that your strata is well represented or represents your population proportionally. So with the next, under the probability sampling technique is what we call the systematic sampling, right? Systematic sampling, right, involves you selecting the sample at regular intervals from the sampling frame. It involves you selecting the sample systematically at regular intervals from the sample frame. Here, members from a larger population are selected according to a random starting point, but with a fixed and at periodic intervals. Right, so these intervals, called the sampling interval, is calculated by dividing the population size by the desired sample size. So it's systematic, right? There's an initial sampling point, right, which is selected at random, and the cases are selected at regular intervals, right? So it's a systematic selection whereby members from a larger population are selected at random starting points, but you have a fixed point, but this is done at periodic intervals. The other type of probabilistic sampling technique is what we call the cluster sampling technique, right? And the cluster sampling is a probability sampling technique where researchers divide the population into multiple groups called clusters. Here, the researchers divide the population into multiple groups called clusters. Now, the researchers then select random groups with a simple random or systematic random sampling technique for data collection and for data analysis, right? The researchers now do that through a simple random or systematic random sampling technique for data collection and data analysis. So probability cluster sampling is a probability sampling procedure in which your population is divided into discrete groups, or what we call clusters, right? And a random sample, right, of these clusters is then drawn, whereby you are able to identify the key samples you want to choose. So I think that's it for the probability sampling techniques. Let us look at non-probability sampling techniques, right? So if you do recall, right, we mentioned that for non-probability sampling, right, this is a sampling method in which not all members of the population have an equal chance of participating in the study. Now, non-probability sampling are adjudged to provide information-rich results, right? And there are, of course, many different types of non-probability sampling techniques. So let's look at some of them quickly. So the first is what we call the quota sampling technique, right? The quota is a non-probability sampling that ensures that the sample represents certain characteristics of the population chosen by the researcher. Quota is a non-probability sampling that ensures that the sample represents certain characteristics of the population chosen by the researcher. Now, in quota sampling, the researcher creates a sample involving individuals that represent a population. In quota sampling, the researcher creates a sample involving individuals that represent a population. Here, the individuals are chosen according to specific characteristics, specific traits, or specific qualities. Here, the individuals are chosen according to specific traits, specific characteristics, or specific qualities. Now, another non-probability sampling technique is what we call snowballing. And snowballing is quite a common, right? It's a common method of common sampling method, right? And snowballing is commonly used when it is difficult to identify members of a desired population. Snowballing is used when it is difficult to identify members of a desired population. So, for instance, people, let's say you want to find out about people who are working while claiming unemployment benefits, right? It's quite difficult to identify those people. It's quite difficult to identify members of that certain population, right? So what happens here in snowballing is that as a researcher, you try and make contact with one or two people within that population, right? You try and make contact with at least one or two people, right? And after you've spoken to those two contacts, you now ask them to refer you to two new contacts, right? So if they refer you to those two new contacts, when you finish with those additional two new contacts, you ask those new contacts to refer you to an additional set of new contacts, right? So you ask those new contacts to identify further new contacts, and so on and so on. Then you may then stop when no new contacts are given, or when your sample becomes large enough. Then the next non-probability sampling technique is what we call convenience. Convenience is usually the easiest sampling technique, right? And it's what we call haphazard sampling, right? It involves selecting haphazardly, right, those samples that are easiest to obtain for your sample. So this is you just obtaining samples that are quite easy for you, right? Very easy for you to approach, very easy for you to identify, right? For instance, you are like, let's say you are interviewing someone random, right, in a shopping center for a TV program. You are doing a TV program and you see someone randomly and you stop the person. Hey, hi, hello, do you want to join me for my interview, right? So it's done haphazardly, right, and involves selecting people or respondents or samples that are easiest to obtain, right, for your research, right? It is actually a very common sampling technique, but of course, because it's easy, it is usually acknowledged to be prone to bias, right? Because the sample is chosen because of the convenience or the ease at which you obtain them. Now, another non-probability sampling technique is what we call the self-selection, right? The self-selection is a sampling technique, and this occurs when you allow each case, right, usually individuals, to identify their desire to be part of the research, right? This is where you allow each case, usually individuals, to identify their desire to be part of the research. So what do you do here, right? First of all, you publicize that you need people for your research. You do that through taking out an advert via media, right? TV adverts, whatever approach you want to use. You publicize your need for people either through advertisement via the media, asking people to participate. And when people have signified their interest, you are able to now proceed and collect data from those who respond. Now, the final sampling technique is what we call purposive, right? And this is usually the one that I usually use a lot, right? And it is a form of non-probability sampling technique, right? Which is referred to judgmental, or the use of an expert sample, right? It is referred to as judgmental or the use of an expert sample. Now, the main objective of the purposive sampling is to produce a sample that can be logically assumed to be representative of the population. The main objective of the purposive sampling is to produce a sample that can be logically assumed to be representative of the population. Here you use, as a researcher, you use your judgment to select cases that will best enable you answer the research questions and help you achieve your research objectives. Now, I think the truth here is that in this form of sampling is used when working with a very small sample, right? And it is also used when you wish to select cases that are rich in information or highly informative, right? So in a nutshell, purposive sampling is a form of non-probability sampling technique referred to as judgmental or expert sample, whereby the goal is to produce a sample that can help you address your research questions and, of course, meet your research objectives. So, in summary, for your study and for your data collection, my advice is try and ask yourself, what are the benefits of probability and non-probability sampling technique, which fits within the frame of your research, right? Probability is usually associated with quantitative research, non-probability usually associated with qualitative research, right? You want to ask yourself, do you need to speak to people? What are the background? What are their skills? What experience, right? And in my advice is always use a pilot study. A pilot study helps you test your questions, also helps you gain experience, right? And helps you fine-tune your research instruments, right? So you must weigh the benefits of your data collection approach. Do you want to use, in terms of identifying your samples, are you going to adopt a probability sampling technique or a non-probability sampling technique? Thank you, and speak to you soon.